before sunrise on a mild summer morning in June 1995. A 27-year-old television news anchor named Jodi Huisentruit hurriedly left her apartment in Mason City, Iowa, headed for work. But she never arrived, and her disappearance has never been solved. In 2003, two television news reporters created FindJodi.com, a website dedicated to preserving Jodi's memory and keeping her case alive. This is the official FindJodi Podcast. Welcome back to the FindJodi Podcast. I'm Scott Fuller. Sometimes in Jodi's case, we can get so wrapped up in facts and timelines and theories, we can lose context of the day-to-day life and sort of the person that a victim was. She had a unique career that relatively few people have, and that she was on television. But Jodi, just like everybody else, had a social life, friends and family. In Jodi, you have a 27-year-old young woman away from home, aspiring to goals, in search of happiness and finding her place in the world. At the end of the day, that's what we're all looking for. Some of the best people to learn from about Jodi's daily life in those years then were her colleagues. Brian Mastre is currently an investigative reporter and anchor for WOWT-TV, NBC's affiliate in Omaha, Nebraska. But in 1995, when Jodi Huisentruit was abducted, he'd been working at Jodi's station in Mason City for a few years, and had increasingly been working alongside Jodi, up to the summer where she disappeared. On this episode, FindJodi team member Caroline Lowe interviews Brian about his experiences from back in the day, and the reporting work he's done on Jodi's case in the 26 and a half years since. That's coming up next.
Mason City is about 10 miles from my hometown of Clear Lake, Iowa. So I went to college in Minnesota, and I interned at KIMT in Mason City in the summer of 91. It was one of those places where you actually were on air interning, and they gave you a few $100, every week. In terms of internships, it was pretty attractive. You actually got a resume tape out of the deal, and were able to maybe carve your path. But I still had school left after that summer. I remember getting a call, we have an opening, will you come work here? But I was like, I still haven't graduated yet. I'd kind of like to graduate. In the meantime, I covered the Twins World Series as a stringer, which was pretty neat to be able to be into the Metrodome at that time and covering a World Series as some 20-year-old kid. And then when I finished up school, then they hired me in the fall of 1991 and just started in as a general assignment reporter. A few months later, a main anchor had left, and then I got promoted to being the 6 and 10 o'clock anchor there. So it was pretty interesting. A lot of people got to see me grow up at the same time I was kind of learning the business. I grew up in the area. This was the station I watched, and then now I'm kind of in charge of it. So I felt I had to work pretty hard to get people to trust some kid telling them the news.
It was your hometown station. It was the station you watched growing up.
Right. I remember going there for a career fair where you would meet some of the people in high school. You go from there to a community college, maybe a bank, those sorts of things, and get an idea of what was going on. And then here now I'm there kind of doing my thing, getting paid to tell stories, which at the end of the day is a pretty good gig.
So Jodi Huisentruit started working at KIMT in 1993. Were you anchoring at that point?
In 93, I would have been the 6 and 10 o'clock anchor. At that point, I believe I was the executive producer, too, so I kind of was trying to help. I know it seems kind of odd, but here I had a couple years of experience, so I'm helping some of the new people try to craft their stories and learn tricks of the trade and how to tell a better story and maybe how to contact sources, that sort of thing. Jodi kind of crossed paths with her, not a ton, so I'm working in the evenings. She's working in the mornings, and then I started to see her more maybe in 94. All of us wanted to try to advance our careers, and I think she was hearing back from people where she would send her resume to news directors, and I think they wanted to see not just her anchoring, but they realized that she wasn't really reporting very much. And so I started to work with her more because she was trying to do stories and get those on the 6 and 10 o'clock news so that she would have a reel of her not just anchoring but also reporting.
What kind of reporting did she primarily do then? We've had a lot of questions about whether she ever did investigative reporting. What do you remember about the kind of reporting you coached her on and what she was doing?
Jodi typically was doing stories that were, job fairs, more feature stories is what she was doing. Because part of it was that she kind of had a really short window to try to do her stories because she anchored the morning show and then did the midday news. So she kind of had some time maybe in between the morning show and midday and maybe after lunch to try to do the story and then maybe write it up in her free time or maybe the next morning and try to turn it around. So there isn't really a lot of hard news or breaking news that maybe is happening before lunch. So a lot of the stories she was doing were on people and feature stories, not real hard-hitting.
Probably day stories that she'd work ahead on, maybe the next day type of things or features.
Yeah, if it wasn't something that was happening that day, she would work ahead. Like a blood drive that was happening that day, you had to pretty much do something that day. It would seem odd if you saved it, but other things, maybe the woman who makes 1,000 quilts every week or something like that would be easy to hold that later in the week.
How well did you get to know Jodi outside of work? I know in smaller stations there's often, it's almost like a family for a lot of the people there because you are in a smaller market. What was it like in terms of your socializing with Jodi? Did you socialize with her? Did you go to, say, her birthday party?
No, I didn't go to her birthday party. We didn't really socialize much on the weekends. I know Robin, my co-anchor, did quite a bit, but we kind of were in different circles for the most part. A lot of newsroom folks hung out together, but Jodi didn't necessarily hang around with the newsroom folks aside from Robin. And so we didn't really cross paths very often on the weekends. Sometimes there would be something that would kind of cross with maybe if somebody in the newsroom was having a get-together and we might end up stopping by or something like that. But usually it was more work relationship than anything.
If we can go back to that morning, June 27th, 1995, do you remember how you first heard that Jodi might be missing, and walk us through how things went for the next few hours?
Yeah, I got a call from, I think it was one of my colleagues. I don't remember which colleague. Seems kind of odd when you look back at it now, but I got a call that morning from a colleague who said that Jodi hadn't shown up for work. And we knew that Jodi had a golf outing the day before. She wasn't always on time. She tried to enjoy having a life, even though you had to get up super early. So we didn't think it was foul play or anything like that. We just assumed that she had too good of a time, was just maybe taking a mental break, and just decided not to come into work. So I didn't think twice. I knew it was in her character that if she just needed a break, she'd take it, or, maybe stayed out too late. Maybe she was just calling in sick. It would have been a little later, mid-morning, when we were told that this is a big deal. This is suspicious. It's not just someone sleeping in. It's foul play. I knew I needed to get around in a hurry because normally I probably wouldn't go in until maybe 1:30, 2 o'clock. And so I'm getting around, and I'm pretty sure I got there maybe just after midday, so 12:30, 1:45. Within a few minutes, just talked to the bosses and people who had been at the scene, and then put together a quick script. And back in those days, we had a camera, an old camera, sitting up high up in the corner of the newsroom, and then I just typed up a script, about 40 seconds worth. That's what really made it sink in, is actually typing the words that a colleague is missing, and she had been abducted from her apartment on the way to work, telling folks that expect an update, I think that afternoon, when we learned that there was going to be a news conference with Mason City Police. So I can remember, feeling the weight of that moment as I was trying to pass along that information, realizing that even though it was personal, I needed to do my best to give it the urgency and the respect that it deserved.
As far as you know, you were the first person, at least in television, to report, to tell the viewers that this person they normally would see at the 6 a.m. news and at the midday was missing, and there were concerns.
As far as I can tell, yeah, we were the first ones that broke in. I remember driving by the scene when I was on my way to work down Kentucky Avenue there, and the apartments, and it was blocked off quite a bit. I couldn't get very close, but I knew I needed to get into work, and I knew we'd had other people, reporters that had been down in there. So curiosity, I wanted to get close to kind of see it for myself, but I also knew I needed to get in and start putting the news of the day together because this was the biggest story we'd had in some time. I mean, we're just 20-somethings trying to do good work, and here we're now caught in the middle of the investigation because we all know who are the first people that investigators zoom in on, right? It's the people who are closest to the individual. So in the view of the FBI and the view of the Division of Criminal Investigation, we were suspects. And at the same time, we're trying to get information from these folks who were wanting to interview us to find out what we can pass along. Is there a break in the case? Do we have a suspect? All the kinds of things that you try to put together. And on top of that, we're getting calls from the network. CBS came that day to do a story from, I believe their Chicago bureau. We had Twin Cities stations, Des Moines stations that were coming to do stories because Jodi was from Minneapolis area. We're trying to bide time because we know those first couple of days, the first 48 hours are so critical, and tracking down leads and getting the story out there. We knew it was in our best interest to do interviews. So some of what I'm saying now, a lot of people wanted to know back then, what do you think happened? Who could have done this? What should be the next step? So we're getting interviewed by other journalists at the same time that we're trying to piece together the story.
What was it like as a male colleague to get that kind of scrutiny as you described? Feel like you had to be potentially eliminated as somebody who could be involved?
I don't know if I really took it that personal. It was more shocking. I still remember I felt like it was a good cop, bad cop interview in the conference room where the salespeople normally meet at KIMT, where you had one of the detectives trying to ask pretty benign stuff like, do you remember what arm Jodi would carry her purse? So while you had somebody asking you what shoulder a purse was on, then the other detective would jump in and want to know if you were in a personal relationship with the individual. So they're looking for clues, I'm sure, trying to figure out whether to rule somebody out or to keep going after somebody. They're trying to figure that out rather quickly as well. So I didn't take it personally. I knew they were just doing their job.
What was it like that summer? You were wearing white ribbons, if I remember correctly. Your colleague's missing, and you're covering it as the biggest story in Mason City.
I don't remember how the ribbons came about. Maybe it was a viewer or something. I'm not sure. I know the yellow ribbons that were put around trees, I think, came from an individual at the local Y, put himself into the investigation at least, and injected himself to try to foster support and get the information out there. And so the yellow ribbons around trees, and then I think that just kind of spurred into we started to wear white ribbons on our lapels. Someone made a whole bunch of them and delivered them to the newsroom, which was very kind. A lot of people were bringing snacks and food and doing what they could. You know, the Midwest, a lot of people feel like they want to try to help out, but they feel a bit helpless. They don't have information on a disappearance, so they want to do something that they know best. So sometimes that's cooking or making things, that sort of thing. It was a crazy time of trying to navigate. At the beginning, it was a morning news conference and an afternoon conference, so we're working really long days, carrying a lot of information live and trying to investigate as many tips as we get into the newsroom, and at the same time knowing that we're doing our due diligence to pass along stuff to the FBI because they have much greater resources than we had to try to solve this case, and you never knew which one was that tip. You get so many pieces of information, and you never want to be the one where you overlook something, right? 10 years later it comes back where if you just would have paid attention to that one, maybe something would have happened. But when you're getting calls from psychics and folks who do other different types of visions, I can see where sometimes that gets a bit overwhelming for investigators. It was surreal. My desk was just above, so we were on a second level, so I could look down and see her desk. And if I remember right, I think it was cleared off because the investigators came in and grabbed everything they could on top, thinking that maybe there was a clue that she had left behind if she had gotten a call from a stalker or was investigating something like that. I think they were going through everything they could on her desk. But I mean, we tried to just kind of put our heads down, and we knew we had a job to do, and the best that we could do was to keep moving on and get the information out there to help solve the case and find our missing colleague. You tried not to get too wrapped up into the emotion. There'd be moments where it would hit you, where you're writing something and thinking about something, or you'd see a picture on air, or someone would call with a personal memory, or you'd talk to the family, and that was pretty rough too, because they're hoping that we were just holding back, but we have some information we could give them that maybe gives them hope, and you always would leave those conversations feeling pretty empty.
Did you feel fairly soon in the investigation that most likely she had not just taken off, that something had happened to her, that she'd been abducted?
Yeah, it was pretty clear, at least after lunch, once we had talked to investigators about the belongings scattered on the floor, and then hearing the timeline that she had called and said she was going to be in, and then no answer, and then nobody was at the apartment. So at that point you knew it was pretty bad. It's just, you thought that there'd be some tip that would come in. But if you look at the timing of all of that, it's like the bad guys had a couple hours to do what they wanted to do, and 2 hours from Mason City, you can get to Minneapolis or Des Moines and beyond in a couple of hours. So that makes the search area pretty widespread. Over
the years, you moved on from KIMT, and you've continued to report on Jodi's unsolved abduction, even since you've been an anchor in Omaha since then. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you did a special report on the 20th anniversary of Jodi's abduction in 2015, and I understand you came back to Mason City for the 25th anniversary. I don't know of anyone else who's continued to cover Jodi's abduction who was part of the original crew. What motivates you to keep reporting on the case? What keeps you going and keeps you interested?
There's probably twofold. One is that I'm still in a position to tell those stories. Two, I think it's my duty to keep telling that story. I have a unique perspective on it, and I have, I guess, a big megaphone. So in a way, I feel like it's an obligation. It's not like a burden on me to tell the story. I think it's something that, you find out that so many people remember this from back then, and then you get into this next generation 25 years later, and folks are like, yeah, I don't know anything about it. But then you wonder, will it be a jailhouse confession? Will it be a deathbed confession at some point? Will somebody say something that will make the break in the case and say it to somebody now that perhaps it registers by us getting that story out? If a grandpa says something and you're kind of like, oh, that's just grandpa, he's dying, and you don't know anything about Jodi's disappearance, this blonde anchor woman from northern Iowa just being snatched, maybe you don't take any special merit of what you're hearing. But if we're keeping that conversation going, at least to some degree, maybe it just kind of keeps those spokes out there, and somebody might end up tripping over something and catching a wind of it, and there's that one little clue that we need to find something.
Have you ever had viewers in Omaha reach out to you about the case that either knew about it or had information?
Yeah, I mean, I get some of the letters from people I've been getting letters from for 25 years, and investigators get those too from people who believe that they're always being overlooked and they know who did it and this is it and that kind of a thing. But every time I do stories on it, I'll get new information from somebody who felt like what they had seen or what they had heard didn't really have much merit. But then the more they think about it, they realize that, geez, maybe I should talk to detectives. So yeah, there's been folks that we pointed in the direction to talk to the FBI and share what they know, because to them it's that it just didn't feel right in the gut for whatever the circumstance happened to them, and they knew they were in Mason City at that time, and so then they will share that knowledge with me, and I'll share it with investigators so that they're able to kind of look up on these people, because I mean, it's pretty striking. You hear that from a lot of people where our instincts are pretty good when we're in situations that are just uncomfortable. Sometimes it doesn't mean that that person is a serial killer, but it also can mean that they're up to no good, and you can kind of maybe get a line out or maybe some information on somebody that has a bigger plot at hand if you just listen to yourself.
I saw in some of the interviews you did for the special that included a now deceased PI that worked for Jodi's family and couple of FBI investigators. What was your takeaway from your interviews with them? I know that they don't tend to tip their hand too much, but did you come away with a sense that they really do feel they have somebody, that they have confidence it's going to be solved? What were your impressions when you did your interviews?
I'd say it was a mixed bag when I talked to FBI agents and then a private detective from here in Omaha who worked on the case in the mid-'90s. Doug Jasa, who's since passed, if I remember right, he didn't think that anything that we'd ever find out. He had gone through, like, the birthday cards from her party the weekend before, trying to look to see if there was any weird clue that the killer might have left behind in a card. And a number of years later, I even went out to central Nebraska with him to investigate a tip that we had gotten from some guy, and I forget the process of it, but they use, like, natural water and other things to help try to find bodies, and they thought that they might be able to pinpoint the body. So there's a lot of things that we look into in this job, and it never ends up being on air. And then there was, when I talked to the FBI, I wouldn't call it a trick of the trade, but a lot of times on old cases, I always like to ask investigators whether it's a case that they think they know who did it but just can't prove it, because we often hear in a lot of real-world stories and in TV shows that, a lot of evidence points to a certain individual. It's just not enough to put them over the threshold for a conviction. And so I asked the FBI that just to kind of get their gauge on it, and I got a sense that they weren't sure if they have talked to the killer. Maybe they're just good at not passing along what they really believe, but I got a sense that they felt that there's a part of them that even if they think that they might have, that they aren't convinced that that individual might have done it.
You are frequently interviewed by the network crews about the case. You've been on a number of shows. I just wonder, where are you today and how you personally feel affected by this? To many people, it's an unresolved mystery, but it's one that happened close to home, and it's much more than that for you as a former colleague.
I think it's depressing the older I get. Part of it might be because I have a son of my own who's now probably getting ready for college here in a couple of years, and so it's hard not to see somebody in those shoes and the parents who are just struggling and waiting, and the time just keeps passing. You don't have any answers. So it's it keeps getting sadder in a way that, we're in a business where when we tell stories and we have the answers, and if we don't have the answers, a lot of times you can kind of point to the different questions, and then the viewer can come up with their own answer. But in this case, it's, we really don't have those answers or even things to kind of point viewers in a particular direction. Sure, there have been people of interest over the years, and I'm sure some viewers think, like, that guy did it or that guy did it. But until you have a suspect named, none of us are right at that point. So I think it just gets, in a way it feels just as exhausting when I do those stories now, because I just think about how rough it was trying to, just stay on top of the story and then function as a normal person while you're in just waist-deep news for just weeks on end. And I mean, I think for 3 weeks we did, I'm probably doing 16-hour days, 2 news conferences a day, interviews, all that other stuff, talking to detectives, and then you have to make those tough decisions about, okay, we don't have anything new on Jodi, so what do we do this week? Do we ignore it? Do we just give a little update? Because then you're kind of wondering, well, if we quit doing anything on it, now we're going to look like we're so callous, and the viewer will be like, what'd you do, just forget about your colleague? And there's all those decisions behind the scenes that you had to try to figure out. How long do you wear the ribbon? Do you ever stop wearing the ribbon? All those different things that you never thought you'd have to try to make decisions on. and then how you cover anniversaries and all the stuff down the road.
And it's certainly nothing you ever learned in studying journalism. It's nothing prepares you for something like this.
Yeah, I don't remember any chapter in my journalism classes that talked about how to deal with that. And even if it did, I'm sure it's so different because, I mean, when you talk about stations' first reaction, even today, is to like, oh, we have employee assistants, we have people you can talk to and this and that. And while all of that is probably better than it was back then, it doesn't really help you deal with all the other questions that are coming that you're grappling with. And yeah, but I also, there's a part of me where I kind of will tell myself and some colleagues too, where you just kind of realize you have to suck it up because, you know what, I wasn't abducted, so I think I can handle this part of it and carry on and try to just keep fighting the good fight.
What's your take from being on the inside and looking at it now maybe from the outside a little bit? Why the interest in Jodi's case?
I think it comes down to there's a lot of footage of her, and she was in people's living room, as I like to say, free of charge every morning. And unlike movie stars, where you often see them on the big screen, the pandemic was a little different because you saw them more in your living room. But for people who are on the local news, you know that they live in your town. You know that you might see them at the grocery store or maybe at the golf course. And so there's more of a personal relationship there because you're talking about the things that they talk about in many cases, the weather that they hear about, the same sports teams. And so once you combine that local relationship that you have, and then you realize that every market in the country has people like that, and then you have an unsolved case at 25 years now involving someone like that, I think it's very easy for everyone to kind of put themselves in those shoes and to imagine if that would have happened to the people that they watched on the air. And I think that's probably why it continues to have legs.
Have you ever thought about what it would mean both for, obviously, Jodi's loved ones, her family, her friends, and your KIMT family over the years, what it would mean to finally have answers?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. The family often would talk about closure, and then you'd hear stories when you talk to other families of victims, and they'd kind of talk about how closure kind of sucked because even though they got an answer, they still don't have their loved one back, but at least there's maybe this part of their brain where they're not constantly filling in the gaps. And I think that's what you saw with Patty Wetterling. She ultimately, no matter how awful it was, she just wanted to know what the truth was. And, I think after a lot of time passes, that's what folks just want to, at the end of the day, want to know the truth of it. And on top of that, did this person ever do it again? Because there's always that aspect where you talk about hope. And when you're talking about hope, you know that everybody has that hope meter at a different spot. For some people, hope is like at 100%. Others might have single-digit percentage of hope. And it can mean a variety of things to different people. For some, it would be the individual coming back and being the exact same person you remembered them only maybe 25 years later. Maybe for somebody else, it's about just getting those final answers or justice, just putting away the people who did this so that it can be an example that folks don't get away with this kind of stuff. And I think that's where it kind of falls for me.
Anything you'd like to say to anyone who's listening to this podcast today who might have information on what happened to Jodi?
You go back and you try to think about certain specifics of a day from 25 years ago. I mean, you can't remember what you had for breakfast. You can't remember this or that, right? But when something happened that really made the hair on your neck maybe stand up, or maybe it made the hair on your neck stand up a couple years later when you heard it from a friend or you heard somebody talking about it. Those are the kinds of examples where, from talking to people, they remember a lot of elements around that moment in time. And if you had examples like that happened to somebody, or as a piece of information, That's what police are often saying when they say no piece of information is too small that we want to hear about and want to run through our record check and try to figure out if this is good or bad, or do we put it into the check on later file, or maybe it's the missing gap in two pieces of information that they have that now finally point at someone, and then they can talk to somebody based on that information. So I know a lot of people will say, well, geez, who's going to remember anything new 25 years ago? Or there's Brian talking about something from 25 years ago. If somebody knew something, it would come up by now. But there are examples of stories where things come out years, decades later, and the way science is too, you never know if something pops on some of the DNA that they have of Jodi. I know they have Jodi's DNA. I know they have other DNA in evidence. They haven't told us what they have, but if they have something to check it against, that's what they would use on it. I mean, they've certainly not given up where they had, as well as they had the search warrant a few years ago where they're trying to see where the GPS of a person of interest vehicle had been when they thought he was coming to Iowa. And so when you hear that kind of information, they had something happened where it made them get a search warrant. Otherwise, you wouldn't just do that on a whim. And you wanted to see where he was going because, what do you say? People like to revisit scenes of crime, so they probably had that in their head. And so it shows that there's still new things that are kind of popping up over the years, and maybe folks listening to this, have that moment that they've just been hanging on to and thought it was they didn't want to bother with it. But trust me, it's okay. Bother us with it.
Find Jodi is a nonprofit run by volunteers with a mission of keeping Jodi's unsolved case in the spotlight. Anyone with information about Jodi's case can reach out to the Mason City Police Department. Information can also be provided to the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigations. You can also contact Find Jodi anonymously if you prefer. Don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. For the entire Find Jodi team, I'm Scott Fuller. Thank you for listening.